Hi guys, this is Taylor and I'm here this evening with my January wrap-up. I would say that this was a decent reading month. It wasn't great, but it was definitely better than my last couple months of 2018, if you remember those. So let's just jump right in, shall we? So the very first book that I read this year was Last Night in Nook by Nivea Corneliusson. This is a multiple perspective novel about a group of young people living in Greenland and coming of age and just making discoveries about themselves and about the people they love. I enjoyed this one quite a bit. One of the things I was most curious about going into this novel was what being a young person living in Greenland is actually like, and that's actually one of the things that this novel does the best. Even though this novel is pretty tiny, it does go right into the meat of things and really addresses what it means to identify as a Greenlander, and really just brought up some very interesting perspectives on life in Greenland, some of the social issues that are present there. This is also not afraid to play around stylistically, which I enjoyed for the most part. Some of the perspectives are very stream of consciousness, some are long-form letters, and some actually include a lot of text messages, and because of that I would say that this book probably won't be for everybody. And just one of my personal criticisms was that some of the storylines in this book do feel a little bit simplistic for me, but overall I really enjoyed this one. I gave it a 4 out of 5 stars, and it was a really good way to start off the year. And the next book that I read was The Heavens by Sandra Newman, which I finished and immediately lent to a friend, so I don't have it on hand. So I made a whole review video on this book, and if you would like to hear my complete full thoughts on this novel, I would highly recommend that you go check that out, because there are a lot of thoughts and they are very confusing. Basically, this is the most conflicted I've ever felt about a book in my entire life. I've had a whole month to sit with this and wrestle with how I actually feel about this novel, and I still don't really know. This is about a young couple who fall in love in Manhattan in the year 2000, and one of them, Kate, has these very realistic dreams that distort her perception of reality, let's put it that way. The reason that I am so conflicted about this book, because otherwise it had so many strong selling points for me, is that I think there's two ways to interpret this book in the end. One of the interpretations I think is brilliant, and the other one I honestly find very inappropriate. Problem is that I see the argument for both sides, and I still don't know which interpretation is my own. So I'm left with a lot of conflicting emotions. This was a reading experience that I've never experienced anything close to it before. But honestly, I can't give this book a rating, and unfortunately that's still where I stand. So the next book I read in January had some pretty big shoes to fill, but thankfully it was Everything I Never Told You by Celeste Ng. This was one of the books that I had said I really wanted to get to in 2019. It was just high time for me to read this novel. It was time for me to get into Celeste Ng, and this ended up being probably the best book that I read this month. So this is about a mixed race family living in Ohio in the 70s. The father of this family is Chinese and his wife is white, and this is actually illegal in some parts of the country at this time. The oldest daughter in the family ends up dead, and the circumstances are kind of suspicious, and this ends up being a character study of everyone in the family, and we slowly find out what happened to the daughter. This did not feel like a debut novel to me. I was very impressed with the subtlety and kind of the quietness of this novel in a good way. And of course it tackles things like the racism and the struggles that this family goes through. Even as recently as the 70s, the kids in this family are the only Asian kids in their school. This is the only even half Asian family in the town. And of course on top of that these kids are mixed, so that comes with its own set of problems. I really enjoyed this book. I can't say that it quite blew me away, but it really probably was the best book that I read this month, and I'm so glad that I finally picked it up. The next book that I read in January ended up being The Dreamers by Karen Thompson Walker. This was another one of my most anticipated books of 2019, and it was definitely the biggest book in terms of hype. Personally, I was really looking forward to this one because I absolutely loved The Age of Miracles, this author's other book. This follows an epidemic that spreads across a small town in California. It is a sleeping sickness, and for a lot of the people who are sleeping, they are dreaming, and their dreams are accompanied by the highest level of brain activity ever recorded. So unfortunately, this one was a little bit of a disappointment to me. With a plot like that, you would think that this book could do so many interesting things, but it just never really seemed to take one of those ideas and run with it. And also, this was really surprising too, because I remember the writing in The Age of Miracles being one of the standout attributes, and I found some sections of The Dreamers just to be a little bit cheesy in the way it was written. It was really surprising. I guess overall I just kind of felt like this book had so many interesting threads, but it never really went anywhere or did anything or added up to something moving or interesting. I didn't hate it. It was still a relatively enjoyable reading experience, but because I had such high hopes for this one, it ended up being pretty disappointing to me. I give this one 3 stars, I think. The next book I read in January was Mouthful of Birds by Samantha Schweblin. This is quite a surrealist short story collection. It was translated from Spanish. I had really high hopes for it, but I'm very sorry to say that this ended up being kind of the big disappointment of January. Out of maybe 20 short stories in this collection, I really ended up liking maybe 2 or 3, so that kind of speaks for itself. Even 2 really good short stories can't really make up for 15, 16, 17 mediocre ones. My big problem here was that a lot of these stories followed the same formula in that they set up this kind of vaguely unsettling, surreal premise and then kind of strung the reader along throughout the story, and then the big reveal was always in the very last sentence. I don't think that's a bad way to structure a short story, but when over half of them use that exact same setup, it gets old pretty quickly. There's also one story in here that I only really read half of. It got really unnecessarily gory for me, and it involved animal abuse, and I just decided that it wasn't gonna be worth it for me to finish it, so definitely heads up for that. I ended up giving this one 2 stars. The stories I really liked, especially the very last one actually. But again, just even the strong ones couldn't make up for a whole bunch of ones. And the last book I read in January was pretty random. It was actually Garbology, Our Dirty Love Affair with Trash by Edward Humes. This was actually the common reading when I first started at my old 4-year college. So everybody was supposed to read this over the summer and discuss it the first week of school that year, and needless to say, I didn't even come close to reading it, but I held on to it for all these years, and then recently I found out that my library actually had a downloadable audiobook copy, so I figured, why not? This is, of course, nonfiction that details how trash, and especially plastics, are kind of an addiction to humans, and how that addiction impacts the environment, and especially the oceans. I liked this book just okay. I found the information relatively interesting and true as far as I could tell, but I did have some picky little gripes about it. First of all, the author used the word detritus about 1,000 times, conservative estimate, and the other thing is that there would be these just tables of facts and statistics that weren't like integrated at all into the text, and I just think it would have been so much more effective if the author would have attempted to integrate that somehow. And this is specific to the audiobook, and I know that oftentimes the author has little control of how the audiobook sounds and how it comes out, but I just didn't like the audiobook narrator. And every time the author would include a quote from someone from a different country, the audiobook narrator would make an attempt at doing that like regional accent. So like, for example, when the author included a quote from a CEO from a Chinese trash company, the audiobook narrator would do like a vaguely Asian accent, which was just not cute in any way, shape, or form. So Garbology was kind of so-so for me, but some of it wasn't the author's fault, I think, and Of course, I do consider the topic to be important. I gave this one 3 stars in the end. So that was my January, and to drive home one of my earlier points, my friend who was reading The Heavens just texted me to say that she's at the halfway point and absolutely freaking out. Speaks for itself. Poetic cinema. Anyway, definitely let me know how your January went, whether or not your 2019 has gotten off to a good start, and thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you very soon. Bye!